For some people who've experienced extreme abuse, the hope of full recovery seems like an impossibility. Some of these people are so damaged, unless there's some sort of miracle, they're going to be controlled and imprisoned by their past till the day they die. But what if that miracle is death and then resurrection? In today's story, we're going to hear about just that. And if that's something you like to think about, welcome to Check Your Head Stories, where we consider the bright side of things that can be considered quite dark, with tales of the miraculous, curious, and the oddly beautiful. Let's get to it. Check your head. What do you like to think about? On the evening of November 8th, 2013, Cameron Stevens, 24, and his wife Kelsey were out on a double date with Pastor Bill and his wife. Pastor Billy was Cameron's mentor and leader, where Cameron served as a youth leader at the middle school church group. For Cameron, ministry was the most important thing in his life, and he gave it his all. And that meant that he cut corners in every place else in his life, including work, relationships. If it wasn't ministry related, he wasn't going to give it his best. And unfortunately, that included his relationship with his wife. And so, the two couples, after they had dinner, sat in a minivan in the parking lot. Pastor Billy turned and looked at Cameron and started to ask him about his performance within the youth ministry. Cameron thought this was a little odd, and he started to defend himself, talking about how much he was giving, and if he could give more, he would, and he asked ways he might do better. And that's when Pastor Billy asked him, he said, "Well, how is this ministry affecting your marriage?" He defended himself even more, but then he looked over at his wife, who had burst into tears. He realized that something was wrong. Then Pastor Billy looked at Cameron and said, "Cameron, would you be willing to step back from ministry and just work on your marriage?" Cameron was embarrassed. He felt like he'd been set up. He felt completely misunderstood, but he knew that if he tried to defend himself in this moment, that he would blow everything. So he said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." All Cameron could hear was that he was being rejected. He thought all of his good deeds, all of his sacrifices were for nothing, and he felt no good deed goes unpunished. For Cameron, ministry was the only thing that made his life seem valid. Cameron came from a background that could only be described as profoundly dark. His family fell apart when he was only 3, when his father had an affair with a woman and left his sister, himself, and his mother. His mother went into survival mode. She actually remarried very quickly, and she remarried the brother of the woman his father had had an affair with. This made for a very strange in-law dynamic. And what made it even stranger is the man his mother married was 22 years her senior. Jim, the new stepfather, even though he was much older, he was going to bring stability to this little family that had always suffered with a bit of poverty. He had a great job, and he was well respected in his community. Like most middle-aged men, Jim was a little bit stuck in his ways, but maybe Jim more than most, because he was very staunch and he had a precise set of rules and things that had to be done in certain orders. He was also part of a very strict fundamentalist sect that had extreme ideas and only believed in one version of the Bible and one version of doing things in Christianity. Every other sect that they looked at or expression of faith was considered satanic. Jim was a stern man, and he could be very intimidating. His age and his demeanor quickly brought his young wife into everything he wanted her to be. The children were raised in an environment of fear. Jim had an exacting set of rules and procedures, and any slight deviation resulted in physical violence and verbal abuse. Cameron had almost no freedom, and he was always in a state of being punished, so even the few privileges he did have always seemed to be taken away. He lived with a sense that his father always was watching him and knew what was happening, even when he was out of his sight. Despite Jim's extreme fundamentalism and legalism, he had a secret life. He had a severe addiction to extreme pornography and deviant sexual desires that included abuse of Cameron's mother and his sister. Now, Cameron was very young. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that there was something insidious and demonic about his stepfather. The rules Jim enacted for his family were intrusive. to the point where even going to the bathroom was completely controlled. And Jim would stand by and watch Cameron, this little boy, go to the bathroom and make sure he did everything exactly how he was supposed to, in order. One time, Cameron, just this little boy, he was going to the bathroom and he did something out of order. Jim lost control completely. He became enraged, and the punishment was that he made his stepson eat his own excrement. The beatings grew more severe as Cameron got older, and Cameron lived in so much fear that if he were ever to rebel or do anything to let people know what was going on, that his life and the life of his sister and his mother would be in danger. And anyone outside who began to suspect there was something a little bit off, they were immediately shut down and distanced. It's as if Jim had sort of some demonic protection that made him untouchable. Cameron's mother had been adopted, but she'd never met her birth mother. But somehow the two found each other and there was a reunion. Turns out Cameron's grandma lived only a few miles from where they lived. So there was all of a sudden a new person in the family. This gave Cameron hope because there were grandma dates. And Cameron and his sister would go, then they'd be spoiled, they'd have fun, they'd be loved. And for the first time, he began to have this parental connection that he'd never had before. He still wouldn't dare tell her how terrible things were at home or ask for help, but Grandma began to suspect that there was something really horrible going on. At a certain point, she had a showdown with Jim. She confronted him and told him about her suspicions, and she threatened to call social services. There was some yelling, and Cameron and his sister never saw Grandma again, and social services never showed up. The only upside to this was that Cameron's mother began to realize how serious the situation was, and the marriage began to show signs of falling apart. When Cameron was 13, he began to realize that his home life wasn't normal, and he started to suspect that maybe it wasn't all his fault. It was during this time that his birth father, who had never been part of his life, and he was a very hostile and angry man, began to soften. He wanted to see the kids, and he began to visit with Cameron once a week. While still not a good father or even a good man, Cameron's birth father was trying to be better. And even this weak man began to understand that where his children were growing up was not a good environment. And he tried to reach out to Cameron in a way to tell him that what he experienced on a daily basis was not something that he should accept. And he began to tell Cameron that there might be a way out. Cameron was still so conditioned by years of abuse, he was still too frightened to try and oppose his father. He was afraid of the consequences if there was even a hint of rebellion or exposure. But then something happened. One night, Cameron was at home and he heard screams from upstairs. His mother and his sister were screaming out for help. He thought there was an emergency and he began to run up the stairs. But before he reached the top, Jim emerged from one of the rooms and he saw his stepson running towards him. He said, "What are you doing?" Cameron said, they're screaming, they need help. He said, "No, what are you doing?" He said, "No." He said, "Cameron, what is the rule? Do we run up the stairs?" Cameron said, "No, but they might need help." He said, "What is the rule? Do we run up the stairs?" He again tried to defend himself. He said, "You are opposing me." And he took Cameron and threw him up against the wall and then beat him so badly that he couldn't breathe. Cameron collapsed, and as he lied there, he swore that this would never happen again. Cameron went to his father and devised a plan to get he and his sister out of this house of horrors. A plan was put into effect. He instructed Cameron on a certain day that he and his sister would meet and not go home after school, but come and meet him at the bus stop, and then the three of them would escape. Cameron and his sister agreed. In the meantime, Cameron's father went to the police and told him about the situation, and told him about the plan to meet the kids and get them out of this dangerous situation. He believed that the police were going to help him. However, it turns out Jim had friends at the police force. They came to Jim and told him about what was going on and about the plan for the children to escape with their father. At the end of the school day, Cameron and his sister weren't allowed to go home, and instead of meeting their father at the bus stop, they were met by Jim. Once again, this evil abuser was able to avoid being exposed and put in prison. Cameron shuddered as they started to head back to the house about the beating that he was going to be exposed to, and he determined that if this man ever put a hand on him again, he was going to get a knife and he was going to stab him to death. Fortunately, Cameron's mother had had enough. When they got home, she informed Jim that she was divorcing him and she was taking the children and leaving. Surprisingly, he didn't fly into a rage and beat them. Apparently, he'd gotten too close to being caught to bring any attention to what the situation was. He was going to let them go, but he wasn't going to let them go graciously. Apparently, Jim had been planning this for years. He already had his exit strategy. He had set things in place where his mother was not able to touch any assets. She wasn't able to get any kind of child support. And he was so vindictive that he forced the house into foreclosure and took the loss rather than give his wife and his stepchildren any of the assets of the house, so he wanted them to be completely destitute. Cameron's mother had a lifetime to develop her survival skills. So when she saw the situation she was in, she immediately found another relationship, another man to marry, and so Cameron and his sister had a new stepfather. Now, they thought that maybe they had escaped abuse and this would be brighter, and it was. But still, he was another abuser, but not nearly to the point that Jim was. Despite his deeply disturbing church experience, Cameron still tried to be a Christian. He still had a hard time reconciling the deep darkness that he experienced at home and what he would hear on a Sunday morning in a church service. So he tried as hard as he could with strict adherence to the rules, just like he'd been brought up to do. He thought if he somehow could get that right, eventually he would find the peace he was longing for. Or maybe if he could get others to believe, maybe peace would come by everyone believing, a sort of consensus. He was drawn to a girl in high school who was his girlfriend, but she was agnostic, and he tried everything he could to get her to convert. But eventually she said, "Look, I am not interested in this," and I rejected outright. Somehow, Cameron internalized this. He felt another rejection. He felt another pain. He thought that somehow he was displeasing, and he took everything he had out on a metal pole. He remembers closing his eyes and hitting the pole as hard as he could. Apparently, this attack on the inanimate object was so severe, it landed him in the hospital with eyes swelled shut and hyperventilating. He was having so much panic and so much pain. But as he lied there at the end of himself, that's when he had a vision of Christ. And Christ appeared to him as a father figure. And for the first time ever, Cameron understood the love of a father. He saw the grace that was there, and that was a life change for Cameron that was unbelievable. Cameron immediately began to serve as a helper for a ministry for middle school kids, and he continued to do so after he graduated high school. And as he entered his young adult life, he met a wonderful girl named Kelsey who became his bride. He believed that she had the same passion that he did, and she did. But it wasn't long into their marriage that he began to spend more time ministering than he did at home or doing anything else. And that's what brought us to this night in the back of a minivan. After that night in the minivan, Cameron had a hard time moving graciously into this new position of ministry. He was still allowed to come to events on a limited basis, but when he did, he had to just be sidelined. He was benched. He was allowed to be there, but he had to keep his mouth shut. He smiled, and when he did speak, he just tried to act like he was being gracious about it, but inside he was agitated. He didn't know what to do with himself. About a week into this, the rage just kept on growing, and then 10 days after, he was asked to come and help move a couch that had been donated into the place where the ministry was meeting. Cameron met Pastor Billy and one of the kids from the youth ministry, and they picked up the couch. But they were having trouble maneuvering this huge piece of furniture, and Cameron became so frustrated with the kid who didn't seem to be able to follow his instructions that he started yelling and he threw a mini tantrum. Immediately he realized that he'd blown it, and now he was going to be sidelined even longer. He tried to collect himself and he kept quiet, but inside he was raging. They were able to deliver the couch, And then they went into the gym where people were throwing basketballs around, and he stood at the sidelines. Now his mind was like a caged animal, and he thought, I need to get out some of this rage. So he jumped onto the floor and began to throw some balls around. He was shooting, and he went up for a layup, and just as he did, he fell back. This wasn't just a simple fall. Cameron, a 24-year-old athlete, had had a heart attack. And as he lay on the floor, he was convulsing and his eyes were rolling back in his head. Pastor Billy, watching from the sidelines, ran to his side. Now, Pastor Billy was an ex-Marine. He was trained in rescue. He told someone to call 911 and he tried to assist Cameron somehow, but then Cameron had something called breathe your last. That's when you take a deep breath in and you breathe out, all of your limbs shoot out, you turn blue, and then you die. And that's what happened. Pastor Billy got down on his knees. He was administering CPR. He called for a defibrillator machine and they brought one to him. He began to administer the shocks, but it wasn't bringing him back to life. Over and over, frantically trying to save his life. And then finally, one last time with the paddles, and there was a faint pulse just as the EMTs arrived. They got him in the ambulance, but he seized several more times on the way to the hospital. Once they got him to the hospital, there was little hope. They put him into an induced coma. When Kelsey arrived, she sat by his side. She refused to leave, but they kept telling her, this is going to be hopeless. The experience that he had, he's going to be in a vegetative state if he ever comes out, but it's very doubtful he'll survive this. But she sat by his side, praying in this darkened, cold room, night and day, and she refused to go home. But after 6 days sitting in a darkened room, a male nurse walked into the room. Now, this is not a nurse she'd ever seen on the floor before, but he just walked in, he looked at Kelsey, and he said, it's time for Cameron to wake up. Kelsey just looked at him confused. He went over to Cameron's body and began to remove all the tubes. Once he had completely disconnected him, he said, Cameron, wake up! Then the nurse just stepped to the side. Kelsey was confused. She just ran over to the bedside and wondered what was happening. This seemed so strange. But then Cameron woke up. Cameron describes what he saw. Even in this darkened room, the room seemed full of light, and all he could see is his wife and her radiant smile in the yellow smock that they provided her. Kelsey looked up to the nurse and there was no one there. Later, when doctors came in and examined Cameron, they could not explain why he'd come out of the coma, why he was able to talk, why he could move his body completely. They said, this is a miracle. According to the neurotransmitters and his condition, this should not be happening. This is miraculous. What's even stranger is no one could identify who this male nurse was. He was not an employee anywhere in that hospital. Cameron and Kelsey believed this was an angel. Miraculously, all of Cameron's faculties were completely functional. It's like there had been a reset. Now, he had to relearn things. He had to relearn how to walk, how to drive, how to go to the bathroom, and this time without some draconian ritual. But he was relearning everything, and Kelsey was with him every step of the way. It wasn't long before this hulk of a man had completely recovered. When Cameron talks about his life and the miraculous things he's experienced, he said he was never mad at God at any time. He's not even angry about the early abuse. And he will say that since his death, he's a different man. Cameron completely appreciates the miracle he had with his resurrection and with his healing. He's also grateful for the miraculous encounter with an angel that he and his wife had. But if you ask him what the greatest miracle was, it wasn't his resurrection. It wasn't the encounter with an angel. The greatest miracle is his salvation, and then the fact that his life got a reset. People talk about being born again and having that spiritual renewal. But he said, in a quite literal way, I was born again. I experienced life in a whole new way. This reset was able to bring a psychological and emotional healing that probably wouldn't have been possible had he not died and started over. Cameron's also very realistic. He said just because you experience a miracle doesn't mean that everything falls into place. He experienced the miracle of God being there faithfully every day during his recovery and his healing as he relearned how to walk and drive and do everything else. And also as his marriage experienced healing. He says, I've still got a long way to go, and God will be faithful through all of it. But this time I'm able to do it without that huge monkey on my back of being a victim. God delivered Cameron from victimhood and gave him a whole new emotional base to work from. Now he's just like the rest of us. We're all struggling and trying to figure out life and get over things. But now he's able to do it in a way that never would have been possible before. Cameron also realizes that he was on a toxic path and he was trying to do something very good in his ministry, but he was doing it for the wrong reasons. It was destroying himself, it was destroying his marriage, and ultimately it would have been a detriment to the very people he was trying to serve, and it wouldn't have glorified God at all. God saw this and gave him something very unique in a way that's not so easy to understand, but still there's a beauty there. Such is the nature of miracles. Well, I hope you like thinking about this because that's what this channel is all about. So be sure to like and subscribe because here at Check Your Head Stories, we're going to keep bringing you stories of the miraculous, the curious, and the oddly beautiful. See you next time.